Welcome to the Extraordinary Podcast, where we identify God's uncommon work in common life. Recognizing God's work requires intentionality, but articulating it motivates and inspires. Don't forget to subscribe to never miss an episode. In today's episode, I have a conversation with Sam Thompson about his life growing up in the church, what kept him connected, and how we can connect with the next generation to make sure that Jesus can impact their life. So let's get into my conversation with Sam. Sam, thank you for being on the podcast today. We appreciate you taking time to share with us today.
No problem.
As we begin, can you share a little bit about your life growing up, your family, just what was life growing up for Sam?
Sure. I grew up in the church, the larger church, not necessarily the Nazarene church from the start. We went to a different denomination. I guess I don't necessarily go into what it was. I don't know if that matters. But we went to another church in the area up until I was in about second grade. At that point, my family just decided we were kind of just doing the whole Sunday morning, go to church, and the rest of the week just not really live that church life. There were other events and stuff, but I think my parents both, they both said that they wanted something more, and they just weren't getting it there. Ironically, I think I said on Mother's Day a while back that my mom is really the reason why we kind of, as a family, got the courage to leave our old church, because my parents were comfortable, and I think my mom eventually just said she wasn't comfortable, and she wanted to, or she was not comfortable with being comfortable is what I should say, because she felt like she wasn't being challenged enough. So they ended up looking for churches in the area. We tried various churches, and we ended up here. And ever since then, since second grade, I've been coming to this church. While I was in the church, going to children's church, I got saved at a young age. I can't remember the exact time. I was young enough that it was kind of, walking through the sinner's prayer and things like that. In children's church, probably 8-10 years old, and so I had been saved, but I would still say that my faith was still very surface level for a long time, even through youth group, through all of high school. Really, it was just kind of ebbing and flowing with the way the world works, and high school and all the pressures with that. And I would say that there was a span of time at about, I think it was about 2012 to 2013. It was my first year of college, where I was still in the church every day, every week. I was still serving in the church in various capacities, but I think there was a span of time. I didn't even speak to God once in 6 months, a year. I can't remember the exact span of time. And I think I was just kind of going through the motions completely, even while being in the worship ministry and other things, in places that people thought that I might have this strong faith, and I didn't. And it wasn't until the summer of 2013, my dad he had told the youth leader at the time, who needed help with their summer camp. He said, Sam and I will help. Didn't ask me first, but he offered my help, and I, of course, when he told me that, I said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go to church camp. I just want to do my thing. I want to stay here, and I don't want to be involved. But even with my fighting, he said, I think this would be good, and they need help, and you've been in the youth group, and you're still young. I was only probably 19 at the time, so still very young, and as I said, I was very distant in my faith. I didn't feel like I was at a good spot to be a leader in the youth group, and really what happened that week, and on the way down, I was still kind of in a bad mood and everything, and just not really being who I should be as a leader of the youth, because I just honestly wasn't really a leader at the time. And that week, there was just, I remember the moment, or the sermon that was being spoken by the speaker that week. of a local church in the area. It was in Fredericktown, Missouri. He had us all walk out to the little beach area. It was a really rocky beach, and he said, "Go, just find a rock, any rock, just something that just jumps out to you, and bring that back." And what he told us to do is to memorize that rock and to really just absorb what that was. And he said that rock is something that should be a reminder to you of God's firm place in your life. And ironically, the rock that I had, it just kind of jumped out to me. It looked like a little foot. It was just like a flat little rock, and it had a foot and an ankle and everything. I thought it was really cool, but it almost was symbolic to me of like that was God's footprint in my life. And it's that week that I really had my at the time I called it my kind of second salvation moment, where I was like, it wasn't where I was getting saved, but where I was accepting that my life should just be absorbed in God and revolve around God. And I think since then I've come to realize or decide that was kind of like my sanctification moment, where it was like where God was, he knew I was saved. I knew I was saved, but I hadn't fully given my life completely to God. Not saying that I've lived a perfect life since then, but saying that like since 2013, I've just been so much more focused on wanting to do what God wants for me in my life and in every way. So that's not my entire life, but that's somewhat.
Well, that's great, and I appreciate your transparency and sharing, and it's encouraging to hear how God has worked in your life and is continuing to work in your life. Can you briefly share the different ways that you've served and are serving in the church?
Yeah. So I kind of briefly mentioned it that I serve on the worship team, and I have served on the worship team. I would say that's by far my longest standing ministry that I've done in the way of serving.
Can you admit what you do on the worship team?
I play the drums.
So that
some
can
some people may like that, some people may not, but I like it. So I've done that since a very young age, admittedly way before I should have. I started playing drums and percussion in school in 5th grade, and I started taking drum set lessons from our now worship leader, Chris Van Buskirk, in 6th grade. And I think there was about halfway through the school year or something, in 8th grade, the existing drummer at the time for the church had to go on vacation or something, and he said, "All right, this week you're playing on praise team." And I was like, I'm not good enough for that. But I did it, and I've since then the drummer at the time, he was kind of moving on with college and things like that, and I've pretty much been about the sole drummer for the church since. I think I tried to do the math of how many hours or whatever I've played in this church specifically, and it's just like of the last 14 or so years, I've played probably most Sundays that have happened since then. I've had very few weeks that I just haven't, and it's something that I've just really enjoyed, and it's caused me to I think ultimately that's probably why I stayed in the church, or one of the reasons why I stayed in the church, because I went through that moment of not really following God, but it's like serving on the worship team, even though I might not have been doing it with right intentions, was still at least keeping me here to the point where I was being exposed enough that I could get pulled right back in and do the right thing. So that's one area that I've served the longest. Another area was kind of led into that. My prior little section was a youth leader. So I started helping with the youth when I was 19. I did that for a few years, up until I was about, I would say 22 or so, was when I stopped being a youth leader. That was shortly after my wife and I my wife and I, this is going to sound horrible. I was a youth leader. She was in the youth group. Your son was. Anyway, sorry. She was 18 when we started dating. Her parents gave approval and everything. I was not.
I think we need to. I think her parents more than gave approval. I think they were wanting you guys to get together. So just make sure that they didn't say okay, whatever. They were very supportive of this.
Now we've been married for
almost 4 years.
4 years and have a child together. We're happier than we could be. So it could have been otherwise. So yes. My wife, after she graduated, I think we just went through a time where we decided that it wasn't right for us to be leading the youth group. She was only 18. I was young enough that at 19, all the way through 22, I still don't think I was necessarily at the right maturity level to be leading youth. But at the time, I think it's something that it kept me here again. And I think it's proof that sometimes people think that to serve in any sort of ministry, they have to be completely spiritually sound to be in ministry. But honestly, depending within reason, certain ministries I think require a higher degree of spiritual fortitude. But it's sometimes just getting involved. It's really what you need to have the courage to go further in your faith. And I think that's a powerful thing that happened to me. But regardless, so that was, I did youth for that time, and then kind of intermixed with that time, I also served on the church board for 3 years. I think I was voted on, I was only 20 or 21. I think the first year you were here was the last year that I was on the board, so it was 2 years before that. So 2016, 2015. 2015 or 2016 is when I was voted on, and I served for 3 years there. I'm thinking of, I guess I haven't been on the church board. I've continued to serve, and there's so many other things I'm trying to think of. But
No, that's good. But I do like the point that you mentioned of serving kept you connected, and if people aren't serving, it's real easy for them to either only come to church to absorb in a selfish way, and if you do that, then if you only come to church for what you get out of it, you're going to leave dissatisfied. But also it makes it real easy for them to slip away. But if you're connected, you may not be perfect. You don't have to have it all figured out to be part of the church, and I think that's important because no one's perfect, and everyone has a place that God can use them. And so I just think that's a great testament to what being connected did for you and how God used that. So you were 13 or 14, so when you first started playing the drums, is that the first time you actually started serving?
I might have done like carrying buckets for corn or something here and there, but largely I would say that was the first time I actually served and enjoyed serving. Because when you're a kid, your parents want you to, and you don't always want to as a kid. But
and why I bring that up is I think it's great that you were asked to serve at the point where you didn't feel ready, and maybe you weren't, but the church needs to make space for those who are developing and growing, and sometimes us adults can be grumpy about kids and teens, and if we don't make space for them, they're going to go find something else. But you're an example of how space was made for you in appropriate ways, and it kept you connected and allowed God to work in your life. And so I just think that's great. I appreciate you sharing that, and I hope people don't miss that point, because no matter how old the person is, whether we're talking about a 90-year-old or a 9-year-old, there's space for them in the church, and God can use them. So right now you and your wife Kelsey are investing in the youth again, and mainly you have middle schoolers, but that's kind of the bulk of it right now. But what obstacles do you see teenagers facing, whether you're talking about life or being incorporated in the church as a whole? What obstacles do you see teens having right now?
Sure. And I guess before I go into that, I should give my wife the proper credit. She's the NYI president, and she's the one leading. I'm helping, but she is ultimately she's doing the most of the work here. So, not saying I'm doing nothing, but she has a huge passion for it right now. So,
but you're still young enough that you can relate to what the teenager's going through, and a little different level than most people in the church, because you're still in your 20s.
I am 28. My wife is 24. So even she sometimes thinks that she might be too young, but I think that's natural. But I think what we see with the youth is the world is really pressing hard on them, especially at the age that they are. The majority of our teens are technically not even old enough to be in the youth group yet, but we're still, making a space for them because they're just in this really in-between spot. I think middle school, if you ask most people, is just kind of a weird, tough time for everyone. I know it was for me at least, but I think that we're seeing a lot of times that the things that they're referencing, the things that they're saying, they're very much engrossed in what the world around them is bringing to them. And I think at such a young, impressionable age, it's difficult sometimes to cut through all the noise of what they hear at school, what they hear from their friends, their families, whatever, to speak about Jesus and what he's done for us, what he can do for us, and how we should live our lives in a way that honors him. I think that's it's one of the things that we try to drive home, regardless of if they want to do the lesson or not. But I would say that even in that tough situation of not knowing always how to fully feed into them and to do what's right for them, there have been some victories in that. There's even one youth member who he didn't come to our church. He would go to church sometimes with his family, Easter, Christmas, things like that. But ultimately, he was not really, involved in any sort of church activity or church group or anything. Mm-hmm. And one of the other youth members, who is the son of someone who's very, they've come to the church for a long time. So he was already going to be there, but he invited this friend, and at first he, sixth grader, not really interested. But there's been times that, like in our first study, which was the book of Luke, there were times that he would recall stories that even some of the kids that have been in church their entire lives had not recalled. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a testament that no matter how young they are, as long as you're willing to give them that time that they deserve, the attention that they deserve, someone's going to hear it. Someone's going to be impacted by it. It's just a matter of giving them the proper respect to know that they are a kid, they are young, and they might have different viewpoints, they might have different pressures on them, different things that they say that may or may not be something I would do or that I want them to, but to let them know that regardless of what they say, regardless of what they do, that we're still here for them, and that they are valued in the grand scheme of things.
Mm-hmm. As you were talking, it made me think of, everybody's discipled by something, or everybody's influenced by something, and older adults tend to be discipled by CNN or Fox News, right? And so the issues are the same, but they manifest in different forms. So like these kids are influenced by YouTube instead of the traditional media outlets or something like that. So I think on some level we can see that these kids are facing the same type of issues that the previous generations were. It's just contextualized to what's meaningful to them. But as you're talking about, giving them the space or investing in them, people just want to know you care. Mm-hmm. And when teens know you care, they'll be interested in what you have to say. Sometimes, and I'm not trying to overgeneralize, but adults can get grumpy about teens, and so all teens see is what adults don't like about them.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I think as adults, we need to step back and say, how can we show this teenager that we care about them?
Well, I think that's something that I heard a few years ago in a men's group study that we were doing. Someone even said, they were talking about how someone had mentioned that kids these days are, disrespectful or all these different things, and someone else mentioned they're still kids. So do you want that child to, or in this case, they're not necessarily children in the context of a youth, but do you want that young person to act like an adult? Because adults aren't perfect, as you said. Adults are sometimes arguably harder to deal with than children. There's more you're fighting against because they've had more influences on their lives over time. I think that everyone becomes more jaded as they get older. So to completely discredit the young person as they're just young and disrespectful, I feel like you're just setting them off on the wrong foot with all of these other pressures that they already have. Now you're giving this negative pressure from inside of the church, when inside of the church should be, in some cases, it might be their only source of positive pressure, a positive thing in their life. So, I think it's something that is a huge struggle as an adult. My wife and I joke that I'm the bad cop and she's the good cop. She might let them do more than I do. I would like sometimes, but then there's other times that I might want to get stern, and then she, after the fact, she's like, "You might have been a little too stern there." I think it's just maybe the roles we fulfill there, but I think that it is ultimately important to know that they can come here and not get just another negative experience.
And I think kind of what you're talking about is ways that adults invalidate the next generation. And you may have experienced some of that when you were growing up, but in general, you were given space. And because of that, you stayed connected. And I'm not trying to put you on a pedestal, but to recognize that your experience is probably fairly common. That you became 19, 20, and you're kind of like, is Jesus who I really want to follow? And you have these questions. And if we don't allow space for those questions in the church, people are going to find answers outside of the church. And rarely does that result in Jesus.
I mean, I've definitely seen that firsthand. I said I was a youth leader back a few years before we started doing it again, now with my wife as a leader. But, when my wife was in high school and I was still a youth leader at the time, a lot of people that went to high school with her or were around her age, she's one of the only people that I know of that group of people that is still consistently engaged to that level. I think that's probably, unfortunately, way more common than a lot of people would know, because they see these youth groups that might be huge. Ours has grown and waned over time, but they're like, back when the youth group was taking up the whole corner of the sanctuary, a lot of those people, when I look now, it's very tragic, because I still love them and I still care for them, but it's just, I've seen that the direction that they've gone has sometimes been slightly veered off of where they were, and other times way off from where they were. And it's, the tragic thing to me is that young people, I think people look at children and then they look at teens. They're like in high school and they're like, we need spaces for these people when they do think of that. But unfortunately, I think, especially in this area, because we're just not a college town, even though we have a community college in the area, college is really the time when I've noticed so many people just either drift or completely get just pushed away, because I've heard people say before that there's, they get out of high school and they still want to go to youth group, but then they're too old really to be in youth group, and then but we can't tell them to go to the adult classes, because the adult classes are sometimes, people in their 50s, 60s. They're very different parts of their lives that they're in, and I've heard people say there's no college ministry at one time or another, and then those people just go off. So I think it's very important to one, have something for people of really those young ages, but also to give them that respect.
And another thing I don't want to miss is a lot of times we keep kids and teens separate from the adults, and then by the time they graduate high school, say, okay, now you got to change how you believe ministry should be done, how it's been done for you, and we got to shift your mentality. So it's things like having you play in the worship team at 14 prepared you, and maybe not perfectly, but to be incorporated into the adults ministry. But if we don't incorporate the kids and the teens and adults all together, then we have this disconnect. And and there are other things, but I just think we have to make space for them while they're kids and teens in order for them to have a space when they become adults.
Yeah, I don't know the exact saying. There's something I heard a long time ago where they said something like, you can try to teach a kid, morals or values up until they're about 16, and then at that point, that's when they start to really formulate their own ideas of how things should be, and a lot of that can change from what they've had from a young age, but I think it is largely involved with what they've heard their whole lives up to that point. They can formulate a lot of their decisions based on that point. You talk about earlier about how adults are influenced, like kids are influenced by video games and YouTube and things like that, where adults are influenced by news. Unfortunately, I've heard some of these young 6th grade boys that are saying political hot button items, and I know they don't fully understand, but I know that they've heard it from their teachers, from their parents, from their friends, who have heard it from other people. I think it's one thing where as the newer generations start coming up, I've noticed the struggles have changed, where in the past, well before my generation or your generation, everyone went to church. People of the baby boomer generation, their parents were just, every Sunday they're going to church. Even if they didn't necessarily fully live their lives that way, they were at least somewhat exposed to it. And there was this idea of a moral system that generation wanted to hold true to. And as each generation has grown up, and then they've had their own kids, I've noticed that it's just been getting more and more skewed away from the church and away from any moral system that God would deem as appropriate. And I think that the struggle now is that my generation, I'm a millennial, would be my generation. I was born in 93. And people that are my age are having children, and the people that were my age are, it's all over the news how the millennials are or whatever. But I think that there's the stress on church in general has just completely gone away. In my generation, not completely, I shouldn't say that, but percentage-wise, it is very, very uphill battle for Christians, and then their children are just getting those same things pumped into their heads. So that's tough. Yeah,
it is tough, and that's the world we live in, and I think we have to make sure that we don't make excuses, that we see what it is and how can we do better. But I also think there's optimism, there's hope. So is there anything about your generation or the upcoming generation that's giving you hope, maybe some untapped potential? We talk about kids and all the energy, and adults say, I wish I had your energy. But is there untapped potential or things that are giving you optimism right now?
So what I see in younger kids nowadays is a lot of passion. That passion can sometimes be put towards good or towards bad. But seeing the passion itself, I think has shown that, especially if you can get some of those passionate young people involved in the right places, namely in church, that they can really take ministries and take the church to a new level because of their passion. And I think that's why it's important to invest in them from young, so that they can have that direction that they're going in. I think you said in a board meeting the first year you were here, you used the example of Vector from was it Despicable Me? So because you said we could all be going in the same direction, but I forget what his saying was.
It's direction plus magnitude.
Okay, direction plus magnitude. So it's like we want to be going in this direction, but we want to be going with such force that it's going to be hard to stop, or so that's actually impactful. And I think that in that case, it was like the direction of the church should all be going in the same direction. But I think that if you think of that same analogy with young people, I think it's like, as long as they can be on the right path, they can be that vector, that strong force, because of their passion. So, yeah.
I think that's great. And it boils down, in my opinion, to casting a compelling vision. That if our church is having a major impact for Jesus, people will want to give their life to that. But nobody wants to give their life to a church that it can just keep the lights on.
Yeah.
That's not inspiring. It's not challenging. And I think, to me, that gives me a ton of hope. If the next generation has this passion, that if the current generation can just connect that to Jesus, then nothing's going to stop it.
Yeah.
So that's great. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to share today?
Not really.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate, this has been a very inspiring conversation for me, and I'm thankful for you and Kelsey, your leadership, and just your commitment to the kingdom and to the ministry that God has called you. So thank you for being here today and sharing. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this podcast. Be on the lookout for how God does uncommon work in common life. And please subscribe to never miss an episode.